Hi there, I'm going to check and set the valve clearances on this 2018 450 EXC-F. First things first, got to pull the seat off, maybe. We're going to pull the tank off. You've got two bolts on each side. The horn's on the left side, you got to pull that too. So these two bolts. It's hard to see that one, but you got to pull this one too. Okay, you can see down here, that's the fuel line. We've got to disconnect that. You basically squeeze the fitting, pull it apart. I'm just going to get a rag, catch any fuel that comes out so you don't get it all over. Oh yeah, we have one electrical fitting here. Just pop this off. That simple. Usually have some kind of brush and I just wipe down any dust, debris, anything loose. This bike's not too bad because it's just a supermoto. But if you ride yours in the dirt, then you want to make sure this is good and clean. It's difficult to see, but in here you got a breather. Your valve cover breather. You need to disconnect that. It can be different. So that breather's disconnected. Okay. Valve covers off, cam chain, everything's right there. So you need a deep 14mm socket for the spark plug. Okay, I've got the rear tire lifted up off the ground, rotates freely. So now that the plug's out, I'm going to put it in gear. And now I can rotate the engine. 6th is usually the best because it's the easiest to get the engine to rotate. Now you can go around and find TDC. That's the exhaust. So now the intake's opening. It's a little difficult to see. There's a punch mark right at the top here. That we want lined up at the very top of this. You have kind of a bridge here, and that's where you want that mark. So when I was talking about timing marks, there's two marks on this cam gear. There's one on the inside here, near the decompression, and then there's one up on the edge. You can see it there, and that's where the TDC mark is. You want to make sure you get that right. So it's the outer one, not this inner one down here, but the outer mark. That's going to make a difference. That might be a little hard to read, but that's the specs we're looking at. So the intake is between 0.10 and 0.15 millimeters, and the exhaust 0.12 to 0.17 millimeters. So I've got 0.15 on that side. And 0.1, kind of like a loose 0.15 on the right side. Because this is a forked rocker arm, I mean it is and it isn't. It's a little bit different than the usual ones you see, but to do this correctly, you should use two feeler gauges, one on this side, one on the other side. That way, if that rocker arm has a little bit of play, it can't rock and give you false readings. So you need to do both sides at the same time. Alright, so when you're measuring the intake, because it's a forked rocker arm, you want to use two feeler gauges. So these are both 0.15 millimeter. The right side's a little bit of a loose 1.5, but I can't get a 1.8 in there. And the left is just perfect, 0.15. So these are on the looser end of the spec on the intake. I'm actually going to change the shims and go a little bit tighter. The engine's been pretty ticky, and I also want max performance, so I'm going to go on the tighter end of the spec on the intake, so that way you get maximum flow getting air into the engine, into the combustion chamber. So I'm going to keep them within spec still, but I'm going to go to the tighter end of the spec, and that's the plan. The exhaust I'm going to leave as it is. I've checked it, and it's sitting at 0.15 millimeters also on the exhaust, which when you look in the manual, that's right in the middle of the range. Okay, I should have mentioned this before. I haven't done this yet because I haven't pulled the timing chain off. I haven't pulled the cam out, but this bolt here, just going to see if I can zoom in on it. So because KTM doesn't have an inspection hole to check the timing marks on the crank down here, there's this bolt they want you to pull out, and they want you to insert a special tool which will actually lock the crank and will keep it at TDC. So I'm going to do that here. I don't have the special tool, but I'm going to pull this out and just have a look. On the older KTMs, you could actually pull this bolt, remove the washer, put that bolt back in, and it would go into a groove or like a slot in the crankshaft, and then it would keep the crankshaft locked. So I'm going to pull this bolt and have a look, and because there's no other timing marks on the crankshaft, that's my reference, that's what I'm going to use. Okay, here we go. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, and also I'm leaking oil, so I should get a rag before a skid plate fills up. See this bolt? It's got a tapered end on it. So I took the bolt out. Washer's coming off. Bolt's going back in. So in theory, the bolt should go all the way in. Like I said, there should be a groove there, a notch for it to thread into. Now what you don't want to do, you don't want it to bind outside the notch and lock the crankshaft and feel like, oh yeah, it's good, it's in the right spot, but it's not. That's what you don't want to happen. So it's a good idea to kind of go in till it stops, loosen it off, and then now I'll move the back wheel and see if it's in the slot or not. There we go. So I went all the way in, loosened off a little bit. I can't turn the engine over at all, it's sitting in that slot. Alright, so to pull out the camshaft, the first thing you got to do, it's really hard to see here, there's a few things in the way. Move that fuel line, let it drip fuel everywhere. These cables. So you've got the cam tensioner right here. This has got to come out so you can get some slack in the cam chain to get it off the gear there. So there's a spring in behind there. Do not let that shoot out and don't lose it, as well as the sealing washer. Don't know if you can see that, but there's a spring, sealing washer, and a bolt. Now it's a ratcheting device in there, so it's still not going to loosen off. It's still tight. So you got to pull these two bolts, and you got to take the tensioner assembly out. Tight here. So there's the gasket that stayed on the engine. We're going to leave it there on the cylinder. So I don't know if you can see that. There's the cam tensioner mechanism. So you can see, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a ratcheting mechanism there. And on that, when you're putting it back in, you'll actually push in that tab and push that all the way in. And now when you put the spring in, it'll push that out, and that'll give you the correct tension. So now, as you can see, we've got slack in the timing chain. So I'm going to pull that 8mm bolt on top. I'm going to I've locked the crankshaft already. So basically, you pull this bolt on top here. Kind of blocking it, sorry. You pull this bolt, and it's got a locking plate that's holding the camshaft in. So you pull that one bolt, and that locking plate comes out. take the cam chain off the gear, pull the camshaft out, and you have access to the shims. Really simple. It's good practice to put rags, clean rags obviously, or shop towels in any of these openings so you don't drop a bolt, a shim, anything that might fall. You don't drop it into the engine. Anything you do drop in there, you have to get it out, because if you don't, you're gonna have a bad day. So there's that locking piece. That's what keeps the cam in there, keeps it in place. Now that that's out, there, cam is out. Simple as that. I have access to the shims. Right on top of the valve retainer there, you got a shim sitting there. If you can see that, there's a shim. So I'm going to pull that out, measure it, and then figure out what shim I need to put back in there to give me the clearance I want. Okay, I just kind of have it written down here. So that's the current. This is what I found. So this is the clearance that I found was 0.15 millimeters. The shim I found in there was a 2.20 millimeters. To get the clearance to be 0.1 millimeters, I'm going to need to add a shim of 2.25. It's pretty straightforward stuff, simple math. So this is what I found. This is the shim I'm going to have to get for the left intake. I'm going to do the same to the right and then go get some shims. Alright, here we go. I went and purchased a shim, and I've just put it on the end of a screwdriver with some grease. And then I'm just going to slide it in there. Just like that. New shim is in. I've already put the shim on the right intake, so now I'm ready to put the cam back in. Okay, cam's ready to go in. So remember, you want to find that mark at the top of the cam gear here. And you want to have that lined up to the very top center. So first, we'll put that. Get my big head out of the way. So you push out this tensioner just to simulate having the cam tensioner in there, and then you make sure that mark lines up. And it looks good. Slide this back in. Now for this bolt, you can see there's old Loctite on there. I'm going to clean that off. So for this bolt, we're going to need some medium strength Loctite. Anytime you're putting bolts inside the engine like this, you either, well, both. You obviously check the manual. The manual will tell you, especially in this instance, to put medium strength Loctite on it, and then torque it to spec, which is 7.4 foot-pounds on this one. I'm going to put this tensioner back in. Remember, that's collapsed. The ratcheting mechanism is all the way in. Okay, I'll put the spring in, and this is what's going to put tension on the cam chain. You can hear it extending. Okay, tensioner's in. Now I can turn the engine over. And when I mean turn the engine over, I'm going to do it by hand, nice and slow. And then we'll check the clearances again. First I'm going to pull that locking bolt out of the crankshaft. So I've pulled the locking bolt out of the crankshaft. Now I'm just going to rotate the engine, always in a forward motion. I should have said that before, I guess that. And I'll rotate the engine, and then I'll check the clearances again. It's going once. Okay, we're back to top dead center on compression, and I'll check the valve clearances again. Okay, so I've got a 0.1 on the left intake, a nice, pretty easy clearance, just a little bit of resistance. And then I've got a tight 0.13 on the right intake. So I didn't quite get the right intake to 0.1 millimeters, but I'm happy with this. This is closer to the middle of the range, so that's really good. Okay, valve cover's going back on. An important step here is if you put rags to keep anything from falling into the engine, make sure you take those out. Torque these bolts to 7.4 foot-pounds also. Now another important step, do not forget to put this breather hose back on the valve cover. So you can see it's pretty simple actually, just you gotta do steps, be methodical, clean, organized, and it's a pretty simple process. I'm going to throw the spark plug back in, put the tank on, put my air filter back in, try to see it fire it up and see how it sounds. And there you go. That's all there is to it.